at Engelhardt. It's a nice night to be not outside. And for those of you out in Zoom land, my wife says, I am a lot easier to take when you're watching me on Zoom with a drink than when you're in person. I hear the ice cubes in her glass even speaking as we speak. Okay. We didn't have sound in the beginning, so old people repeat themselves, so I'll act like an old person. Satchel Paige pitched in Reading, 1961. He is the first of 37, it's going to be more, what are called Negro League Legends, who are baseball players and other people affiliated with the Negro Leagues that got into the Hall of Fame based upon their activities with the Negro Leagues. There are a number of black players, starting with Jackie Robinson, who were admitted to the Hall of Fame based on their accomplishments in the National League or the American League or both. But there is a 10-year requirement that you have to get into the Hall of Fame. And Satchel Paige didn't have that 10-year requirement. And those players like Ernie Banks, Monty Irvin, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, even though they played in the Negro Leagues, they played sufficient time in the organized baseball, the National and American League, to get in. So we're going to talk about Satchel Paige's career, talk about why he's a legend without going long, and we will also talk about the process by which he got into the Hall of Fame, which was not, as I said earlier, without some drama. Finally, we'll talk about the 9 other Negro League legends besides Satchel Paige who played ball here in Reading. And I'm not even going to ask if anybody saw any of them play, because Satchel Paige played in a game in 1961. The last game in which one of those other Negro League legends were involved was 1928. So anyhow, all right, well, let's move forward here. See, the Ageless Wonder. Don't miss this Ageless Wonder. It's an advertisement that was in the Times and the Eagle for several days prior to the big game. Satchel Paige was here, and the Kansas City Monarchs in the Negro League, the Negro American League, what was left of it, there was 4 teams at that time. There used to be a lot more, but in 1961, there was only 4. Kansas City, Detroit, and Baltimore. Anyway, it was all about Satchel Paige, though. People really didn't need to see the Negro American League team play, but in any event, they wanted to see Satchel Paige. And the ageless wonder aspect was that he was, at this point, 55 years old, and he was quite spry. It pointed out in the lead-up article that was a press release put together by the Kansas City Monarchs that he had 71 innings pitched without allowing a run that season. Not consecutively, but 71 innings pitched without allowing a run. And he had struck out 17 batters in one game. And he had pitched at one point to 97 consecutive batters without allowing a walk in the previous season. So yes, he was spry and ageless. The other advertisement you see up in the right-hand corner was in the Elmira paper, which also purports him to be an ageless wonder. So not just was he an ageless wonder, he was a legend. How did he develop this legendary status? Well, he started pitching in 1926 on a semi-pro basis. Before that, he was pitching as a teenager and getting old grown-ups out, but he began to pitch for Chattanooga in 1926 and pitched in the Negro Leagues until 1947, when he was signed by the Cleveland Indians and pitched in the major leagues. But he was the best other than there was a question, was it bullet or no, cannonball Dick? Oh boy, yeah, cannonball. One other pitcher whose name suddenly escapes me. Maybe I know it. Who was the best pitcher in the Negro Leagues? He captivated people's imaginations. One time, Josh Gibson was coming up in an all-star game, and he deliberately loaded the bases so he would pitch to Josh Gibson with the bases loaded. Then he told his fielders to sit down and struck out Josh Gibson, the greatest catcher in the Negro Leagues, and maybe greatest catcher ever, but we won't know. He's in the Hall of Fame. Anyhow, his record that they've put together as they've incorporated Negro League records is 146 and 64. 1,620 strikeouts, only 316 bases on balls. And that's now that the baseball has agreed to incorporate the Negro Leagues into as a major league, they are going over and trying to upgrade Negro League records. They were very irregularly kept because some newspapers didn't keep box scores. They just don't have them. And some you got to take a look and see if they were accurately kept as far as the consistency. He played for at least 15 teams, played in 3 countries besides the United States, played in Mexico, played in Cuba, and played in the Dominican Republic. He also played in many, 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 many leagues. He played in 3 Negro League World Series and 8 Negro League All-Star games. That just didn't reflect the magnitude of how good he was. He was not only respected by the people in the Negro Leagues, because of course this is in the Jim Crow days where segregation existed. He had his own way of measuring what he had done. He said he was pitched more than 2,500 games, 2,000 victories, 250 or so shutouts, 21 game winning streak, 62 inning scoreless streak, and a day in which he notched 3 separate victories and a year in which he appeared in more than 150 games. That's Satch's records. I don't know whether, no matter how hard they work, going over the baseball reference people and the SABR people, Society for American Baseball Research, as they try to coordinate, I don't know whether they're going to come up with these. But in any event, that's the Satch numbers. Those in the know who faced him, who faced him in exhibition games, and that was the only way that he could face white players, was in exhibition games, usually when they were both teams were barnstorming. There was the Dizzy Dean All-Stars, and they would play against the Satchel Paige All-Stars or whoever the All-Stars were that was the African-American team. And they would play serious baseball. And from these games, from the competition, you have Joe DiMaggio, who came up and actually faced Paige at the tail end, or when Paige was pitching in the for St. Louis Browns and Cleveland, but anyway, Cleveland at least. So he had faced him, and his quote was, when he was still in the minor leagues, he faced Satchel Paige in an exhibition game. And he said, when I got a hit off Satchel, I knew I was ready for the big leagues. He was playing for the San Francisco Seals. He said, he's the best and fastest pitcher I ever faced. Dizzy Dean said he's a better pitcher than I ever hoped to be. And would say if he and I were on the same team, we would be going fishing by 4th of July because we would have won the pennant by then. And Hack Wilson, in an earlier era player, said, it starts out looking like a baseball, and when it gets to the plate, it looks like a marble. And Buck Leonard, who played the Negro League, said he was the toughest pitcher I ever faced, couldn't do much with him, and I never got a hit off him. He threw fire. And finally, Ted Williams said he's the best pitcher he's the best pitcher in baseball, greatest in baseball. And Bob Feller, who didn't usually say nice things about other people, much less pitchers, said he's the best pitcher I ever saw. So these Hall of Famers all had plaudits about Satch that they shared, and it builds up to his legend. And then a friend, a manager, companion, teammate, Buck O'Neill, said, of course, the stories about Satchel are legendary, and some of them are even true. So anyway, he knew Satchel. Satchel liked to tell his own stories about things, and the fish kept getting bigger and bigger. So his legend continued in a new dimension. People had heard about Satchel Paige, but they got to experience him when he was signed by the Cleveland Indians in 1948. He was the 7th African-American to make an appearance in baseball, organized baseball, for the second. You had Moses Fleetwood Walker back in 1880, but Larry Doby was signed by Cleveland, and then several other players were signed, a couple by St. Louis, a couple by the Dodgers. Roy Campanella appeared before Satchel Paige. He was the 6th, and Satchel Paige was the 7th to appear. He appears for the Cleveland Indians. Bill Veeck was truly colorblind, and he was instrumental in their pennant drive in 1948. He went 6-1. His earned run average was 2.48. And the Indians were a great team. The Boston Red Sox were 1 game behind them at the end of the season. So that 6-1 record was a big deal. He ultimately, after 2 years with Cleveland, the second year with Cleveland, he didn't do as well, and they released him. He got picked up by the St. Louis Browns, who were now, Bill Veeck was involved with the ownership of the St. Louis Browns. And he pitched there for 3 years and was on the All-Star team twice. Casey Stengel said, if the Yankees don't get ahead in the first 6 innings, the Browns bring in that damned old man and we're sunk. So that was mute testimony from an opponent. So we're moving along. In 3 games, he brought 200,000 people. Now Cleveland had a big stadium, and he shut the White Sox out 2 games in a row that he pitched, which was a remarkable feat, much less when he was a 42-year-old rookie. He was the oldest rookie ever, and probably still will be. He packed them in because people wanted to see. And Larry Tye, who wrote a great biography, which is very readable, about Paige, says, each game he won, he had fans and writers marveling over what he must have been like in his prime, and which other lions of blackball had been lost to the Jim Crow system of segregation. Anyway, that's a picture with him and Joe Louis. After he shut out the White Sox, Joe Louis comes out and congratulates him. So they were 2 very prominent pillars of Black society who were very much looked to by the Black community. He was a legend by the mid-1930s within the Black community. So but he grew to be, his legend status grew as the publicity in the 5 years that he played in the major leagues. All right, back to August 7th, back to what we're talking about. So the Negro League has the Birmingham Barons, Kansas City Monarchs, Raleigh Tigers, the Detroit Stars. They advertise in the paper, the lead-up press release article, we have lots of players that are going to be in the major leagues next year, and they listed a half a dozen fellows, one of whom was Ike Brown, who was the only one who eventually played for the Detroit Tigers in the mid-60s. The Detroit Stars were managed by Willie Washington, who had 35 home runs the year before and led the Negro League, the Negro American League. And the Kansas City Monarchs won the Negro American League Championship. Now, that year they had 5 teams, not 4 teams. So, obviously, the Negro Leagues were hurting because they lost all their players when baseball was integrated. So, the secret weapon on the Monarchs was advertised conspicuously every city they went to. They were going with Detroit on a barnstorming tour. What they did in Reading, they did in several other cities in the Eastern League and in the International League in the East. But John Boo Boo Winston could throw left, he could throw right, he could pitch, he could catch. He could wear a top hat. He was the clown prince of baseball. He was a secret weapon, and he was advertised. It was advertised that he was going to put on a big hitting exhibition before the game in Reading. He was mainly interested in keeping cash customers amused. Reading Municipal Stadium was a very Spartan place. You should, if you were going to see a baseball game during Lent, that would be a good place to go. Back in those days, they had benches. They didn't have individual seats. They were wood. You got splinters. They didn't have a roof over the grandstand. They didn't have the swimming pool. They didn't have the deck. Never mind. And they didn't have beer until 1973. So it looks Spartan, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, it was. So just imagine you're seeing the baseball game on a Spartan night in August, but you're still happy because it's baseball. The press in Reading, Satch was very engaging with the press. Ken Tucky was a writer for the Reading Times, and he was more lighthearted than most of the writers were for the Reading Eagle. The Reading Eagle, they were serious guys. They were serious guys. See Paul Lucas, he was a serious guy. So Kentucky talked to Satchel Paige when he's putting his uniform on before the game. Lucas talked to him after the game while he's smoking a cigarette sitting on the bench. But he had some interesting things to say to each of them. They talked to Satch about several things. One is, the first thing he brought up was how he could still help somebody. He could still help a team. Right now, baseball executives, they get these they could get an experienced pitcher here for nothing. I'd even pay my own expenses for the season, and if I didn't help the club, they wouldn't owe me a cent. I know one thing, I wouldn't be walking in the winning run like these relief pitchers do nowadays. He went on, they pay $100,000 or more for these bonus untried youngsters, and why don't they gamble on me for $25,000? I would be good to help a pennant contender, if only pitching in relief. And all I know is I'm young enough to be pitching in the majors. He had been released in 1958, or he had been released. He pitched 3 years in AAA ball. We'll talk about that in a second. But he was released by the Miami team and AAA team. And he said, I still had gas in the tank. He said this quote that was general. There never was a man on earth who pitched as much as me, and the more I pitched, the stronger my arm would get. His rather amusing, not factually intensely accurate, but amusing, is maybe I'll pitch forever. And I'd recommend that for light reading if you want to do a little baseball reading. He also talked about, now in August 1961, the fervor was the M&M boys, Mantle and Maris. And they were pursuing the goal of 61 home runs, breaking Babe Ruth's record of 60. And by August, Mantle was leading. He had 43 homers, Maris had 41. But as August 7th, they both were well ahead of a pace to break it. They were on Life magazine. They had all kinds of paraphernalia. And so I don't want to take away anything from these youngsters, but pitchers just don't know how to throw to them. My coach always told me, make the sluggers hit to the opposite side. They wouldn't see anything but outside stuff from me. And he did add rather prophetically, somebody's going to break Babe Ruth's record someday. And he's going to break that record of 60. So, boy, he was right. And how old was Satchel Paige anyway? That came up in their conversations with him. And no, interestingly enough, when he went to signed by the Indians, the Cleveland Plain dealer said, I hear the question of his age. How old is Satchel Paige? He's a rhubarb baseball columnist there. Satchel said, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you was? So it's a relative thing, right? So Bill Veeck personally goes down and looks up in Mobile, Alabama, in the Department of Health, their records, and finds that his birth certificate has him being born in 1906. And sometimes he claimed he was older, but mostly he claimed he was younger, so owners would be much more interested in you because you're younger. So that question came up with the fellows from the Reading papers, and they didn't come up with as clear an answer there. He said, well, it's 1907. Anyway, they put their own arithmetic together and came up with the conclusion that Bill Veeck was right. So here's the deal. 1958, I'm 7 years old. I'm a Phillies fan. The Phillies finished in last place. It was the first year I really paid much attention to baseball. And it was the first of many last place finishes. Bill Veeck, after he was done with St. Louis, he was involved in buying the Miami team. He bought him in Syracuse. It was a Phillies AAA team. They moved him to Miami, and he signs Paige because Paige has been let go by St. Louis as well. And he pitches very well. You can see his numbers there for the 3 years in the International League. Somebody could have used him. Come on. Especially in 1958, the Phillies could have used him. Now, they couldn't have used him in 1957 or 56 because that was the first year they had an African-American player. They had John Kennedy in 57. So they probably weren't interested in anybody that was not African-American. Anyway, Henry Mason was their first African-American pitcher. He came up with them in 1958. I have his 1960 baseball card. He had pitched, well, not only on Miami, but he had pitched on the Kansas City Monarchs in the early 50s. So he was a 31-year-old rookie, which is not as old as 42. But anyhow, the Phillies in 1958, they finished in last place. Their earned run average was the second worst in the National League. They could have used Satchel Paige, and people would have come to Connie Mack Stadium, as pathetic as it was even then. But they didn't. So back to the game. Oh, yes, Satchel Paige is in Reading playing again. So he throws 3 innings. He pitches 3 innings. And Paul Lucas is very astute. He counts in the 3 innings, 36 strikes, 12 balls, good control. Satch talked about his great control. And 5 hits surrendered, 1 walk. He leaves the game. The bullpen doesn't do so good. They give up, if you read the Eagle, it's 8 runs, and the Times is 9 runs, or vice versa. Anyway, the newspapers have different accounts of whether Satchel gave up 2 runs or 3 runs. So what happened? There's your 2 accounts. One has a score 11-5, the other has a score 11-6. Why was that? Why was that? They had some problems with the scoreboard. And you can take a look at the scores. Yeah, they didn't necessarily jive, nor did the reporters apparently talk to each other, or did they read each other's papers, even though they were in the same building and had the same ownership. Okay. There were problems at the ballpark that night. First off, they didn't have a PA announcer. Second off, they had no scorecards. Third off, nobody was working the scoreboard. So you had these players that were not being announced, you didn't know their numbers, and they weren't telling you what they were. You had to, if you had your own scorecard, which you brought with you, assuming you, anyway, that was the best way that they could make do. Lucas said that they had a lot of attempted comedy. He wasn't amused with Boo Boo. And a lot of people left rather distressed because of the lack of scorecard, scoreboard, PA announcer. And that's what they did. However, the 1,600 people they drew that night was the biggest crowd that they drew at the stadium, that year for any Indians game, except for Pony Night, which came later. Pony Night, we'll talk about that in a second. But the Indians that year were terrible. The Indians had been very good, and then the management of the team changed, and they had less good players here in Reading. They finished last in the Eastern League, second to last in the attendance. They had no crowd above 1,500 that year, except for Pony Night. And 4,100 people 2 weeks later saw them lose to the Johnstown Red Sox. Who won the Pony Night? And that's going to be a story in the next historical review that my colleague Charlie Adams is going to write. A 17-year-old novitiate at the Bernardine Convent, that's Mount Alvernia. So this young nun wins the pony. That's her childhood picture, but that's another story. But anyhow, consequently, Reading leaves town at the end of that. I'm sorry, the Indians leave town. They leave Reading, and they move to Charleston, West Virginia. The Red Sox come, the Red Sox go, the Indians come back. Nobody goes to see those games either. And then nobody's here for a year, and then the Phillies come, God bless. All right. What does Satch do after the Reading situation? We move on. He becomes the oldest pitcher in baseball to pitch in a game. He signs with the Kansas City A's, who are having a terrible year. Moving to Kansas City from Philadelphia didn't make him great. But he goes and starts a game, faces the Red Sox, only lets one batter reach first base. Carl Yastrzemski gets a single, and he throws 3 shutout innings at age 59, 1965. The gimmick was that he had a rocking chair and a pretty nurse, and it was hanging around for several games before he made his debut. And it was a different pretty nurse every night. So I don't know whether the girl really was a nurse or not, but she would take care of him. And so in any event, that was one significant thing he went to afterwards. Next, he gets signed by the Atlanta Braves. He needs 158 more days before he can qualify for the 5-year pension at that time. He had time with the Browns and time with the Indians, but he didn't have enough time. So he wrote to 20 different major league teams, And the only one that responded was the Braves. And they said, yeah, we can find something. They made him an advisor and a coach and possibly a pitcher. So he got a glove and he would warm up before games, but they didn't put him where he was going to be dangerous. So that was, he had his time with the Braves and he got his pension, his $250 a month when he was able to cash in on it. All right. In the meanwhile, there was a groundswell, particularly in the black press, but also in the white press too, about why can't Satchel Paige go into the Hall of Fame? After Jackie Robinson was admitted to the Hall of Fame in 1962, it was a natural question. Why can't the greatest black pitcher also go into the Hall of Fame? Just because he pitched in the Negro League. Wendell Smith is in the journalist part of the Hall of Fame. He wrote for the Pittsburgh New Courier. There's a couple of articles there. I just had several. One was from 61, 64, 65. Satch gets in 1971, but this is well before that happened. And that's John Crittenden from the Miami Herald. He is a white writer. And he was saying, sure, he should go in. He should go in. So that's just the background. Moving along here. With all this groundswell going on, one guy who steps up to the plate, so to speak, is Ted Williams. Ted Williams in 1966, in his admission speech to the Hall of Fame, says, there's no reason, and I'm paraphrasing, and now I got to get to my notes, because I didn't memorize that. There's basically two fine players are not in the Hall of Fame. Two of the best players I ever played against, Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige. And there's no reason, except for the color of their skin, that either of them should not be in the Hall of Fame. They were great baseball players. Yeah, that's essentially what he said. I got it right. It caught national attention and reinitiated the pressure from the press to continue this going. Now, this is 1966. Finally, in 1971, it's announced that Satchel Paige is in the Hall of Fame. Okay, he's in the Hall of Fame. February comes out. And now, as I said, there's this 10-year rule. And the Hall of Fame, I never really thought about this until I had done some research on this, is owned by a family. Baseball works with the Hall of Fame, but the family owns the Hall of Fame. So what the conditions were, and that is, that's out of the New York Daily News, says this one is, the one says Bowie Kuhn, and the other fellow is a baseball writer, and says, this has been in the attic a long time, this picture of Satchel Paige, and they're moving it into Cooperstown. And the other fellow says, I think we should call it the follow-through of a hesitation pitch. Satch had a hesitation pitch. Anyway, here's the catch. There was a catch. The catch was Satchel Paige's plaque was going to be in a separate wing of the hall, a central part. It wasn't going to be in with all the other plaques. It was kind of like, as they said in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1877, what was overturned by Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, separate but equal. No, that's not what we had in 1971. But Satch took the high ground. He said, I'm happy to be in the Hall of Fame. I'm just happy to be here. Privately, his quote was, The only change is baseball turned Page from a second-class citizen to a second-class immortal. And so that was said privately, but it found its way out. There were leaks. So anyhow, it really hadn't been made clear when he was admitted that this was the condition. Not all the newspaper stories picked that up, even what was implied. So this is going on starts in February, and his induction was going to be in August. Finally, in July, after Bowie Kuhn, much to his credit, hits on the Hall of Fame management, and other newspaper outlets hit on them saying, or give them pressure, come on, you got to do something about this. They say, yep, okay. And New York Times put it, baseball's front door is now open to Satchel Paige. And that was out of the Richmond, Virginia paper. They had a very upbeat account of the decision of the Hall of Fame to let Satchel Paige in too. I included a paper from the South, besides the Times, as giving an account of it. And so happy ending there. He goes in August 9th. He's in the Hall of Fame. He's very proud of his plaque, and he gives a very modest, eloquent speech that has some funny stuff in, because I don't know whether Yogi Berra or Satchel Paige had more funny quotes. I think Yogi lived longer, and he lived in New York. If Satchel would have been out of New York, they would have had even more funny Satchel Paige quotes. But his wit and humor and dryness were unequaled, and except for maybe Yogi. Okay. How did Satchel get in? And how do other Negro League legends get in? They formed a Negro League committee in 1971 that was going to, back when there was going to be a separate wing in the Hall of Fame for the plaques, they were going to pick one Negro League player a year, whether they needed it or not, There's lots of players at that point. So that got loosened up as well. So who came in shortly the next few years? Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, the prominent Negro stars, Negro League stars, African-American stars, Negro League stars were admitted, and now there's 37. In 2006, 17 people were admitted at one time. It was Effa Manley was the first woman admitted into the Hall of Fame. She was the owner of the Newark Bears and was a true pioneer of the development of Negro Leagues. So now there's 10 of these folks that played here in Reading, and we'll talk briefly about them. Not briefly, well, yes. But first we'll talk about the teams that brought them here. Who did they play for? And then you'll say, why did those teams come here? And that's the next question. They played for the Cuban Giants. That was 1885. The Argyle Hotel up in New York had black waiters. And the black waiters on break would play baseball. And the guests at the hotel would like watching them play baseball. And so they thought, why don't we have a team? And they play all the time. So they played to amuse the guests, and then the team began to travel. And then they began to hire waiters that could hit rather than mix martinis in any event. So the Cuban Giants were the first all-black team, because by that time, 1885, the segregation of baseball, the gentleman's agreement had been struck where the owners had not put it in writing, but said no black players in the major leagues. And it was seeping down to the minor leagues. But the Cuban ex-Giants, yes, there was people that had played on the Cuban Giants before, and now they were back on this other team. The teams were fairly loosely structured financially. and by way of contracts. And people were very loose as far as the way they interpreted their own contracts. Players would jump around. Whole teams would become other teams. The New York Gorhams became the York Colored Monarchs. In any event, these were the teams. The Philadelphia Giants were formed in the early 20th century, and they were a powerhouse team. And then they weren't. Suddenly, the owner changed, or there would be a change in the players would all jump to another team that was going to pay them more money. So it was the Hilldale Daisies, Derby, Pennsylvania is where they were out of. They were a dominant team. And the Baltimore Black Sox were ultimately, they got into the Negro Leagues. The Negro Leagues were only formed in 1920. Prior to that, what we call now black baseball, where they were just independent teams that would barnstorm. They would sometimes go into white leagues until things got totally segregated in the early 20th century. By 1900, that was the way. But in the late 19th century, in the Mid-Atlantic League, I guess, Harrisburg and the Cuban Giants of Trenton, the Cuban Giants then played out of Trenton for a brief time. They both were in the otherwise white league, and then they would leave. Then they left. So the Kansas City Monarchs, obviously playing here in 1961, are one of the most historic and well-known of the black teams. And but that's the background of who played here, what teams. And then why did they play here? They played here because this guy here, William Whitman, the man that brought you the pagoda. William Whitman was a baseball aficionado. He was a real estate investor. He was a politician, not a successful politician. 4 times he ran for mayor, 4 times he lost. And he wasn't so lucky sometimes. With the pagoda, he loses the pagoda because he was supposed to get a liquor license and he didn't, and he lost the pagoda in a foreclosure. But he built the ball grounds first at 10th and Amity, and he turned them into a residential area, and next door he built the 11th and Pike baseball, the ball grounds there. And now that's the playground at 11th and Pike. But that was the main ball grounds for years before Lowers Park was built. So how did you make money? If you owned a ballpark, you got fannies in the seats. What would get fannies in the seats? Well, some years they had 2 teams in Reading. Usually they only had 1 team in Reading, and 1 team can't play itself. So you would bring teams in. Doing a lot of research and writing about baseball in Reading at that time, there were a lot of cancellations when teams would stiff Bill Whitman. One team, or the African-American teams, tended not to stiff. They showed up. They were good, and people liked watching them play. They were colorful. They would say things like, "Hey, cut me one there." That was a quote from the paper. I don't know what that meant, but that amused the fans. In any event, the black players would play the white teams. They were always referred to as dusky, or sometimes the watermelon grabbers, which was not complimentary. But in any event, bringing these black teams to Reading to play the Reading teams put money in his pocket. So hallelujah and praise the collection basket, or pass the collection basket. So, but that's why they came. He encouraged them to play the local, he paid them. And they liked to know they were going to get cash. Because sometimes they'd go on these barnstorming things, playing a little town, and nobody would come to the game. Just a quick note about Bill Whitman. He builds the Circus Maximus, because he's going to have the United States Baseball League. And then that goes bankrupt. And then the next year, he's going to have another United States Baseball League. That lasts 3 days. He loses the Circus Maximus in bankruptcy, and it is ultimately purchased by Albright College and is the Albright Stadium now, the old Circus Maximus on 13th Street. And Lucky Bill wasn't so lucky that way. That's just a postscript. I think maybe they had some games that involved some of our Negro League legends in the Circus Maximus in later years. So anyway, who were these Negro League legends? We'll just go through them very quickly. First off, if you've ever read any of the 19th century papers about baseball, they don't do a couple of things. They don't mention anybody's first name, number one. Number two, they don't call the team its regular nickname. They call it the name of its manager. Number three, they didn't do interviews with players. Even if somebody had a good day or a bad day, they didn't have any quotes, no quotes. So the articles were bereft, unless you really get lucky, of any personality of what kind of person was involved or game was involved. So I'll say that now as an apologetic thing. The fellow that appeared here in the most games, no, almost the most. He's the first to come. Frank Grant he played for Buffalo back when baseball allowed black players to play in the late 1890s or the late 1880s. And then he got excluded. He was the second baseman, and the white players would always try to spike him. So he eventually had pieces of wood inside his playing pants, which actually Moses Fleetwood Walker had picked up when Moses Walker played for Toledo, a black player. And but that's how he protected himself. Grant was known as Harry Chadwick is an esteemed historian of that era. He said, if he was known as the Black Dunlap. Dunlap was a esteemed second baseman at the time. Said, boy, if he was white, he'd be really good. He could write his own ticket, which is oftentimes what people would say about black players, and the black player would say, yeah, right, okay, thank you. The most ink Grant got in any of the articles involving him was he missed a train, so he didn't play in that game. So the paper featured that, well, their great second baseman Grant wasn't there because he missed the train. So there wasn't too much, but he was here. He's in the Hall of Fame, and he was quite a player in his time. Next. King Solomon Saul White actually wrote a book called Black Baseball, a history of black baseball, or colored baseball. And it's very detailed. It's very based in a lot of analysis. It's cheap to buy too. It's like $15. It's interesting. He played 14 times he came to Reading, and he played for the York Colored Monarchs. One time he was actually mentioned in an article, what great fielding he had. So he was mentioned for something he did, and then another game he had 2 hits. And so he was mentioned there. That was very rare, that particularly when it was one of the out-of-town players. They would write about the local players much more, but they wouldn't use their first names. Okay, that's Saul White. Now, Pete Hill, in 1905, he played for the Philadelphia Giants. He was a great player. He was an outfielder, had quite an arm. In 1905, the Philadelphia Giants were playing for the Colored World Series against the Brooklyn Royal Giants. And they played 2 games in Brooklyn. They played 2 games in Philadelphia, and it was a best of 5, and the deciding game was going to be played in Philadelphia. Lo and behold, they forgot to lease the ball field and they lost it. So they had to find somebody someplace else, and they couldn't postpone it because the Brooklyn team was leaving on a boat the next day after they had played on Saturday, because Sunday they're shipped to go to Cuba for a tour, be done soon, was leaving. So they played it in Reading. So the deciding game was played before 1,000 fans in Reading. Pete Hill has 4 hits and makes what I would describe as a Willie Mays catch, is how he could describe it. A fantastic catch that saves the day. And he also then managed, but he played for the Philadelphia Giants. Rube Foster was a great pitcher, and he was also a very good outfielder. He played with the Philadelphia Giants in 1905. He played 2 games here, got a couple hits. That's not why Rube Foster's in the Hall of Fame. Rube Foster organized in 1920. He took over the Chicago team, and then he formed the Negro Leagues. He was one of the pioneers of forming and organizing the Negro Leagues in 1920. Sadly, his venereal disease affected his brain, and he died young. But he's in the Hall of Fame, and his magnitude in Negro League baseball was much bigger. He was great on the field, but in the spectrum of the development of Negro League baseball, it was materially bigger. Pop Lloyd, he played with the Philadelphia Giants and played in 3 games, got no hits. Not much to say about Pop, except he was really a good player, and that's why he's in the Hall of Fame. Usually he hit well, and he was known as Cuchara because he was a shortstop, and his glove would get dirty. He would shovel the ball up out of the dirt, which was reminiscent of how Honus Wagner would play shortstop as well. Judy Johnson was a great third baseman. Connie Mack said, yeah, if he were white, he could write his own contract price. That didn't do him any good. He played for the Hilldale Giants out of Derby, and they were very good. Every time they came to Reading, they beat the pants off whoever they played. However, not every time. They lost to Boyertown. They had just finished the Colored World Series that year in Chicago, and they had played a bunch of games. They were going home. They played in Boyertown, or they played in Boyertown on a Sunday in Berks County here, and they were tired, and they got schwacked. But that didn't stop Judy Johnson from getting 2 hits in that game. When they did come to Reading and played in Carsonia Park against the Reading Actives, that was Kaufman's. They played Kaufman's. He got 2 hits in that game too. So Judy could hit, and he was inducted 1975, one of the early inductees. Louis Santop was a hard-hitting catcher. Before Babe Ruth called shots, Louis Santop would call his shots. And he was on the Hilldale Giants as well. And in the 2 games that they played in Kaufman's, and he had 2 hits in each of those games too, as well as the one that they lost to the Boyertown team. They didn't even say, I looked at the box score and there he had 2 hits. They didn't say, hey, that Santop had 2 great hits. But that's what he did. And finally, Biz Mackey was a great catcher. Now you had Josh Gibson and ultimately Roy Campanella, the latter part of the Negro Leagues, but Mackey was thought of as one of the great catchers in the Negro Leagues, and he played for Hilldale and got no hits in those games. So there, enough about Mr. Mackey. Finally, Ben Taylor. He was one of the great home run hitters in the Negro League. Played for in Indianapolis with his brothers. They were a dominant team. Towards the end of his reign, he played for the Baltimore Black Sox. 1928, the Baltimore Black Sox played a 3-game series against the Harrisburg team, the Black Giants, here in Reading. And for one reason or another, that's why they did. Lowers Park was empty, so they played here in 3 days in 1928. One game was reported. All the games were advertised, but only one game was reported. And oddly enough, it was reported by the Harrisburg paper and the Reading paper. And so they had the same game they covered, except they had different scores. One said it was 16-12, and the other said it was 17-11. I guess they were getting ready for that Satchel Paige game a few years later, as far as how you cover pay. Anyhow, no box scores. Taylor played every game I ever saw for Baltimore at first base that I saw reported in box. He was a bellwether there. So I had to assume that he was playing in those games for Baltimore in Reading, but even though he wasn't mentioned in the one article by either of those papers. So that was somewhat of a reach, but he was here, I'm sure. So there you go. There you have it. Our other Negro League legends. And postscript. The Monarchs and the Stars, Kansas City and Detroit, they continued to play games for the rest of their trip, their barnstorming trip. Paige leaves the Monarchs, however, before their barnstorming trip is over, because he gets an offer to pitch for Portland on the West Coast. He can get back into the show. He doesn't do well when he goes out there. They let him go. And in the meanwhile, because Satchel Paige isn't going to come to the game, the word's out that he's not going to be there, they canceled the game. They said, no, we're not going to have your gate attraction. So that's that. In 1962, the Negro American League finally closes its doors. And so anyhow, that's the story of Satch in Reading and the Hall of Fame fellows that are well-kept secrets. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy. Yes.